Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at Iran's controversial nuclear program. This week, dressed in laboratory apparel, the Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, dropped a bombshell. No, not that kind. This was of the verbal variety. Surrounded by scientists at a research plant, he proclaimed that Iran was striding forward in nuclear know-how. New Iranian-built centrifuges can enrich uranium much faster than previous models, he told the cameras. The firebrand leader also blasted the West for trying to bully Tehran with crippling economic sanctions. And what a time to do it. Relations between Iran and the West could hardly be more strained. Recently, we have seen naval posturing in the Persian Gulf, the slaying of Iranian scientists, and allegedly Iranian attacks on Israeli targets in Thailand and elsewhere. And let's not forget the computer virus known as Stuxnet that was reportedly deployed to derail Iran's atomic research. Iran says it is enriching isotopes for medical use and generating power for its 74 million people. Western officials and reports from the UN's nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, say Tehran could be building doomsday weapons. So, does Israel have it right, and Iran must be stopped, even attacked, to stop it from getting the bomb? Is Russia wise or irresponsible in not backing new Western-led initiatives against Tehran? Could Iran even be telling the truth, or at least have every right to build nuclear weapons in secret? To probe these questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by James Blake, an analyst for the Risk Advisory Group, Patrick Hayes, a political commentator for Spiked, Shirin Shafei from the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran, and over the phone from Moscow by Leonid Savin, editor of the foreign affairs journal Geopolitical. First question to you, James. What have we learned this week from Ahmadinejad's announcement?
Well, I think that in terms of what's new, I'm not convinced that he's told us anything new. There's still doubts in my mind as to what Iran's ultimate motivations are in moving forward with the weapons program. And it doesn't seem to me that he's really provided us with any new information other than perhaps emphasising this continued brinksmanship.
Patrick, what do you think about that? Anything new?
I actually think this particular announcement was more for an internal audience than it actually was to rattle sabres amongst the West, as it has been doing recently. I don't think the actual announcement that's being made suggests that there's any major step that's been made towards developing nuclear weapons in the region. But I think, the International Atomic Energy Agency is coming back again shortly into Iran and will use this as a pretext to meddle about in a sovereign country's affairs. And I actually think, that's really problematic. And as you said, kind of in your opening question, Iran should be able to develop these weapons in secret, and it shouldn't really be the business of any other country to kind of intervene in that.
Just to get that point clear, you believe that Iran is developing nuclear weapons, and you think they should be allowed to?
I think it's an open question. The question is, if they were, I think they should be allowed to do so in secret. I mean, obviously, you can have reconnaissance kind of missions to try and understand what's going on, but I don't think it's the business of the international community to start meddling in the affairs of Iran, as it has been doing increasingly over the past years, to kind of put the pressure on. I think that will actually make the situation worse in many ways and could perhaps exacerbate already existing tensions there, in particular between Israel and Iran.
And Shirin, is that exactly the same position as your organisation, or are there differences here?
No, not at all. I mean, I have to disagree with you on this point, because Iran has stated time and again that it doesn't want to develop a nuclear weapon. And even the IAEA reports, the International Atomic Energy Agency reports, there are 35 of them since 2003, and all of them, without an exception, verify the non-diversion of all nuclear material in Iran, including those in outside facilities, which is in hospitals. And also, to add to that, there is a religious decree of highest importance in Iran, a fatwa, which bans the production, stockpiling, and use of all weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, and especially nuclear weapons. So Iran has no intention, and there's no shred of evidence that Iran has ever diverted any nuclear material to military use. So that's on that side. But then going back to your initial question about President Ahmadinejad's statement a few days ago, ago, is that is with regard to Iran's very real need for nuclear energy and fuel rod for Tehran Research Reactor, which produces radioisotopes for treatment of cancer. And nobody is providing Iran with with that nuclear fuel, so Iran has to produce it itself, or else 850,000 patients of cancer will be left without proper treatment.
So just picking up on that, you're absolutely 100% convinced that Iran is not developing nuclear weapons, has no intention in that direction?
Yes, up until now, I think so, yes. I mean, all the evidence and statement that we have coming from different agencies, even, that's interesting you should mention that, because even the Israeli intelligence agencies and American intelligence agencies are saying that Iran has not yet made a decision to build a nuclear weapon. So you see, there is no institution, no value or reliable source that we can refer to and say Iran is having that kind of decision.
But the position that you're referring to there, I mean, it is one whereby they believe that Iran is developing up to a point that they call breakout capacity, where it is close enough to be able to build a nuclear weapon thereafter.
There is not even any evidence regarding that. But even if there was, the IAEA is only responsible to verify the non-diversion of nuclear material in Iran. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, is also regarding the nuclear activities, not nuclear-related activities, which is something is getting mixed up here. And the Security Council and the IAEA are demanding extra legal things from Iran to abide by, which is not under its safeguard agreements or nuclear or NPT obligations.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're hosting a debate on Iran's controversial nuclear program. I'm joined by James Blake, an analyst for the Risk Advisory Group, Patrick Hayes, a political commentator for Spiked, Shirin Shafei from the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran, and Leonid Savin, over the phone from Moscow, the editor of the foreign affairs journal Geopolitical. What's your opinion on what's happened this week, Leonid?
Actually, I think there are a lot of talk and fabrication around nuclear program of Iran, and it is just a pretext for sanctions and pressure on this country. Speaking of current situation in the Persian Gulf, Washington looking for different pretexts for possible aggression, comprises at least 4 options. First is Iran's nuclear dossier. Second is engineering escalation in Strait of Hormuz. Third is allegation that Iran supports international terrorism. And fourth is car bomb attack, which occurred this week in India, Georgia, and Thailand. If Iran, in fact, carried out the attacks, it will provide a justification for war against Iran. So I think at first West and its allies in the region already run criminal-covered war against Iran, including the assassination of Iranian scientists and the incursion of the country's territory with spy drones. And we see that the United States escalates militarization of the region. That is just part of the wider strategy for American global dominance. In the words of militaries, Washington just try to release the Pentagon doctrine, naming full spectrum of dominance.
Leonid, I know you don't exactly represent the Kremlin, obviously, but you are over there in Moscow, you are in Russia, and of course, Russia has backed several rounds of UN sanctions against Iran. Obviously, Moscow does have concerns over a potential nuclear weapons program by the Islamic Republic, no?
Yes, at first I think that sanctions do not provide some arms to Iran. It was a mistake, because Iran is our strategic partner, and we must develop any cooperation with this country. And I think that this escalation is a threat also to Russia, because in one statement of Russian government has warned the United States and North Atlantic Treaty Organization that should Iran get drawn into any political or military hardships, this will be a direct threat to our national security.
Now, James, there's many issues to pick up on here, but if we can go to maybe a couple of the central ones, perhaps the question as to whether or not there is any basis to believe that Iran is building nuclear weapons or on the path to.
I take a slightly different view than perhaps a couple of the other guests, in the sense that, judging by the rhetoric that has come from Tehran, from the president, from the government, the incendiary comments that are coming and being spread through the media, stating their intent against Israel, the lack of cooperation with regional bodies to allow weapons inspectors to understand where all of the nuclear material is being held in Iran, all suggests or indicates or creates suspicion. And I think that if you're correct in the assumption that Iran is not looking for nuclear weapons, nuclear capability, then all that has to be done to rectify this, surely, is to stop the incendiary comments, to allow weapons inspectors to come in, to be totally honest about where this nuclear material is being held, and to improve partnerships and relationships with neighbours across the region.
I think it's important to go back to first principles here, really, and just look at, there's 22,000 nuclear warheads in the world at the moment. About 12,000 of them are owned by Russia, about 9,000 are owned by the US, and then you have Britain, China and France having a few hundred each, and then, you have India and Pakistan with a few, and then, of course, Israel, which has never actually even declared that it has nuclear weapons. Iran has no nuclear weapons at all. It's not even, allowed to fully develop nuclear power, which would provide a modern standard of living for many of its people. And what you have is effectively the only country that's ever dropped a nuclear bomb during wartime, America, putting both Iran and other countries around the world to hostage and saying, you cannot develop. We know better than you. We're going to put restrictions upon your development. It just seems to me to be deeply hypocritical that the only country to have ever dropped a nuclear bomb is the one that's really putting a lot of pressure upon Iran and other countries in the region, including Syria, which I don't think has ever really tried to develop nuclear weapons or even kind of great nuclear power capacities, and is saying you cannot develop. I do think in some ways there's this kind of modern form of colonialism that's going on here, really, where you have Western countries saying, we know better, you can't be trusted, you're acting like petulant little children, and unless you behave, unless you conform to our standards, then you cannot give your people a modern standard of living. I think that's really problematic.
Patrick, you think that Iran is building a bomb or going in that direction, but why do you think they're doing it? Do you think they need it?
I think I should clarify this. I don't think Iran is building a bomb. I was defending its right to build it in secret as a national sovereign country. I think there's a tendency now to just completely ignore borders, using often the humanitarian kind of rhetoric, and to say, actually, we can intervene or meddle about in this country's affairs because it's in the interests of the international community. I want to make a defence of national sovereignty, where actually it should be for the people of Iran to say whether or not we want to build nuclear weapons or not. I'm not sure whether there is any accurate evidence to suggest they are building one at the moment. I don't think they should be building one. But again, I think it should be for the Iranian people to decide that, not for America, which, as I said, is the only country that's ever dropped one of these things in the history of the world.
Shirin, a question to you on the region that Iran is in. There is a nuclear armed Pakistan on one side, India nuclear armed a bit further away, Israel nuclear armed. Many countries that have strong links with Washington, with the United States, surrounding the Islamic Republic. If Iran is developing this nuclear technology, surely it would be irresponsible of the government in Tehran not to be developing a nuclear weapon.
Why? Because looking at the countries you just mentioned, look at Pakistan. How could nuclear weapons help them secure their national interest and security? They are really struggling very hard with terrorism, and they cannot deal with it, even with the help of, if you could call it help, of Americans. Or look at Israel. In that region, which is not that big, how could you ever use nuclear weapons? And even as a deterrence capability, this is the talk of the Cold War period, and Iran is really not interested in that. But if you say that Iran is trying to do that, and then by that kind of spread fear in this region, then you will have a good market for selling anti-nuclear material to all these countries. For example, the America or the NATO anti-missile shield, which was offered to Turkey, or to some massive arms deals to Arab countries of the Persian Gulf. We have to see all of this in light of the threat that is being manufactured about Iran. And regardless, if these countries do not fear Iran, then how could you sell them all these arms? So we see that by magnifying the Iranian threat, America actually has a good place to sell all these arms.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're hosting a debate on Iran's controversial nuclear program. I'm joined by James Blake, an analyst for the Risk Advisory Group, Patrick Hayes, a political commentator for Spiked, Shirin Shafei from the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran, and Leonid Savin, over the phone from Moscow, the editor of the foreign affairs journal Geopolitical. Leonid, next question's to you. Last time that you were speaking, you were suggesting that Iran does have reasons for developing nuclear weapons, and these are its security needs. Is that right?
At first, I think that nuclear weapon is not a problem. Because, for example, Pakistan has nuclear weapon and the situation in this country is not very well. We know about military armed groups with some kind of crazy ideas to control, but Iran is more safe country than Pakistan. And, for example, very famous and respected men like Thomas Barnett or, for example, Kenneth Waltz told that nuclear weapon will be not a problem for region. And vice versa, it will strengthen the region. And Iran will not attack Israel like we see in some mass media hysteria. So I think problem is idea to bring Iran back into the orbit of Western neo-colonial control. So I think it's real aim of regime of United States.
And the position that's advocated by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, I think as recently as yesterday, once again, is for negotiation as the way forward. Is that how you see it, Leonid?
Yes, of course. I think it's a very good position. We must continue negotiation and just try to stop possible war because it will be a problem for next board countries and for Russia. And I think for all over the world will be a big problem if the war will start in this region.
James, one over to you on this issue of negotiation. Obviously, at the same time that Ahmadinejad was making his statement in his laboratory coat, Iranian officials were sending a letter to Catherine Ashton, the European Union foreign policy chief, saying they wanted to restart talks that have been stalled for many months now. Do you see that as a serious and credible attempt to get around the negotiating table?
It's certainly a positive indication. I think with the strategy that the Western countries have been pursuing towards Iran, it's obviously gone through a number of phases from counter-proliferation, sanctions, sabotage, which there's various speculation that Mossad and other intelligence agencies have been playing this part in disrupting the Iranian nuclear scientists. And I think that now with the sanctions, obviously they're very crippling. I mean, they're having a huge impact on inflation, on day-to-day life, and they're quite terrible for the person in the streets in Tehran. And obviously that's going to have implications in terms of negotiations being put back on the card. And I would imagine that the Western's position on this is that their aim is to restart negotiations, and they will most likely ramp down the sanctions if negotiations were to restart.
Patrick, coming on to a couple of James's points there, he refers to the assassinations of Iranian scientists, and of course we mentioned before the Stuxnet virus. Is there any doubt in your mind that this is Washington or Tel Aviv behind these?
Well, no, there's no doubt in my mind that they've been involved in this. But I mean, I think what's interesting and what we've really seen kind of a ramp up on in the last kind of few months is, Syria, I think, is distracted from it a little bit at the moment. But I think we'll see increasingly in the run-up to the US election more rhetoric about Iran. I think in general now, the West always kind of looks to polarize situations, to kind of develop kind of countries that it can see as almost being evil. You know, Iran was part of George Bush's axis of evil. And now there's increasing rhetoric around Iran in the media. And I think what's always telling about these supposedly neutral bodies like the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is going into Iran increasingly and picking up data, is that actually it doesn't really matter what they find in these kind of situations. It can build up a kind of a dodgy dossier of information, which, as we saw with, in the run-up to the Iraq War, was used then as a pretext for intervention. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case in this particular instance. But I think what's interesting at the moment, what's different to even, say, the Iraq War with Iran, is the fact that there's a much greater decline in the confidence of both Obama, Sarkozy and Cameron in terms of interfering in that region. So actually it's much more unstable than it ever has been. Things could very quickly get sucked into a conflict that no one actually really wants. At the moment, there's a lot of bluster, there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a phony war going on, I think, which is good for kind of media grandstanding where, Obama or William Hague from Britain can make kind of big sweeping statements about Iran. But I don't think there's any real desire to interfere and get into another war at this point.
Shirin, the threat of attack, I mean, it's obviously even in the name of your organisation, a campaign against sanctions and military intervention in Iran, obviously something that concerns you very greatly.
Yes, it does. I mean, there is already a war against Iran because sanctions are some people say they're a prelude to war, but I say that they're actually, in fact, an act of war. And we saw that presidential candidate Ron Paul also says this. I mean, this is not something that we can overlook, underestimate the sanctions against Iran, but also going back to the issue of assassinations, which many call murder of Iranian scientists. That is an interesting point because there is now a rivalry in the United States itself between the Republican Party and the so-called Democratic Party, that whoever takes the tougher stand vis-a-vis Iran is seen as being stronger and hence supported more by these lobbies which are supporting presidential campaigns in America. For example, we saw and we heard that Rick Santorum said that. And I quote, he said, it's a wonderful thing that sometimes Iranian scientists turn up dead. And everybody should know that if there are a Russian scientist or an Iranian scientist working on Iranian nuclear program, they won't be safe. End of quote. That is something which is really worrying. And you are hearing this from a high-profile American politician who hopes to be president of the United States. I mean, we hope not. But that is really the threat and rhetoric which is coming out of United States. And also the same thing is coming out of Israel. And then yet Iran is being accused of being threatening, which is really, as the other guest said, it's a high level of hypocrisy and double standards vis-a-vis Iran in this situation.
Leonard, over to you in Moscow, and we're running out of time here. But at the beginning of the year, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations in New York, Vitaly Churkin, said that a potential war with Iran was the greatest threat to world peace in 2012. Is that something that you agree with? And what do you see happening in this, an election year for both Russia and the United States?
Yes, of course. I think that before election in the United States, Washington not to start war against Iran. On the other hand, Washington just to use situation in Russia and try to influence on the situation in our country and to control Kremlin and other political groups here in Moscow. So I think time for now is work for Iran. And Russia just to avoid language of preventive diplomacy and idea of Mr. Lavrov to continue negotiation is, for my opinion, is a good way.
Thanks, Leonard. And I just want to get final comments from James and Patrick. James.
Well, regarding your question there, what are the prospects for 2012? I'm very increasingly concerned by what has been said in Israel, to be honest. A couple of weeks ago, they said that they're reaching towards the zone of immunity, meaning within 3 to 4 months, they see the window where they could supposedly manage through military means to close what they believe to be a nuclear program. And they're increasingly, I think, in my view, looking into the possibilities of conducting a strike against Iran. I think that one of the main reasons that the US has gone down and supported, along with the EU countries, sanctions is because they are taking the threat from Israel extremely seriously. So I think that if sanctions have worked and there's more diplomacy, war will be avoided, but that has to take place.
Patrick, an imminent Israeli strike.
Well, it's just been said about sanctions. I think it's really important to make this point. Sanctions hit normal people on the streets in these countries. And I think there's a very patronising logic from the West that because people are starving or they're unable to go about their day-to-day lives, they're going to necessarily rise up or cause problems within the country. Actually, it can cause and solidify nationalism in the country and a great sense of anti-American and anti-West feeling. So sanctions aren't a silver bullet in this situation. They just mean that normal people will suffer more. I wouldn't necessarily aspire for kind of world peace in 2012 because what we saw very excitingly last year was an Arab Spring, was people all over the Middle East taking matters into their own hands and getting rid of dictators that were seen to that have been there for generations. So I think there should be more of that dynamic. I think the more the West intervenes in these situations, be it in Syria, be it in Iran, the less likely people will actually have true and be able to forge their own history and have true democracy in these countries.
That was Patrick Hayes, the political commentator, warning that sanctions against Iran could backfire. I was also joined by James Blake, an analyst for the Risk Advisory Group, Shirin Shafei from the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran, and over the phone from Moscow by Leonid Savin, editor of the foreign affairs journal Geopolitical. You've been listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned. We'll be back shortly.